This week I gave a presentation at a bank in Belgium, and in the audience somebody said, it's all very nice that you talk about innovation and China's future and how everything's evolving, but how about the poor in China and the rural areas? So how poor is China still? And I'm going to answer that question in this week's Pascal's China Lens. Welcome. Now the question today is, how poor is China still? Because when we talk about China, we always talk about the rich people. We talk about the billionaires being bigger than the US. We're talking about the GDP in 2030 exceeding that of the US. We're talking about purchasing power parity, so the amount of money people have to spend. It's already been bigger since 2014 than America. But this is just a very, very small percentage of the total amount of people, 1, 2, 3% of the population. Most of the people live in the middle class or are poor people. Now, when we talk about the middle class, there's about 200 million families. There's about 550 million people, approximately. Now, 75% belongs to the lower middle class. And that means that they earn between $300 to $600 a month. And the rest, 25%, is about $600 to $1,500 a month. $600 is about the same quality of life you can have as a middle class would have in Europe or in America. So that's kind of like an average. But if you have $300, you're still not really belonging to the middle class of Europe. So 75% is still a problem. And these people, they specifically live in the third and fourth tier and fifth tier cities in China. But specifically, these third and fourth tier cities are the cities that are growing the fastest when it comes to economy and spending and consumer habits. And what it means is that every company is aiming at third and fourth tier cities to grow their revenue. And so these people are slowly actually getting to the upper middle class. So that's going to take 10, 15, 20 years, but it looks like it's going up very fast. Now, the rest is the poor people. And that's what we want to talk about today. Now, we have two types of poor people. There's the poor people that actually can make ends meet, but don't have a lot of comfort. And then there's the extreme poor people, or extreme poverty. And the extreme poverty is what the Communist Party in China really wants to get rid of. If we go back in history, what we see is that in 1980, there was 850 million people living below the extreme poverty line. That's $1.9 a day, $60 a month. That is set by the World Bank. 850 million people by 1990, it was about 750 million people. But today, 30 years later, it's only 5 million people. So the real miracle of China, in my view, is that 750 million people have been taken out of extreme poverty. And that's amazing. Now, most of these people are now part of the poor people in China because there's still 800 million poor people in China. But for the extreme poverty, China's been doing magnificent things. The government in Beijing really asked all the local governments to help these people to get out of poverty. And this has to happen before the 23rd of July 2021, when the Communist Party is 100 years old. And so they've been sending 3 million people, party people, to these places to actually get rid of that poverty and help these people out of poverty. It means infrastructure was being placed, people got houses, 35 square meter per person on average, so that's quite nice. They got relocated to nicer places with streaming water and everything you would need. They got jobs very often in the cities in the area, which was also an agreement they had. They got trained for skills, but also mindset, because if you go to the cities, it's a different way of living. You have to learn how to live in the cities rather than in the countryside. So a lot of things were happening. And this has cost billions and billions and billions of dollars. But China thinks it's important because if you get that lower part up, then basically everything else moves up with it. Now, interesting also to know is that there's been a focus on minorities because a lot of minorities in the West are still quite poor. So it's Yunnan, it's Gansu, it's Sichuan province, but also Tibet and Xinjiang. And these minorities, which often have a different story when we talk about it, actually a lot of them got taken out of poverty. But there's still 800 million people that are basically living on less than $300 a day. That's not a lot of money. And according to Li Keqiang at the National People's Congress, he said there's about I would say 600 million, that's he said, 600 million people living below $140 a month or 1,000 renminbi. So that's the real issue. But what that means is that once this extreme poverty is eradicated by the end or middle of next year, China will focus on the poor and making the gap between the urban areas and the poor much, much smaller. We can expect this to take at least 20, 30, maybe 50 years before that gap gets slower or smaller, but it means that China still has about 600 million people that can give their job or do work for lower wages or at lower wages. What that means is that China still have 50 years to go before they become too expensive. But I believe the most important about poverty and eradication of poverty that China did over the past 30 years is that they could teach the world, because there's still 750 million people in the world living below the extreme poverty line, they could teach people in Africa and many other places how to get rid of it. And I think that's going to be the big change and the influence that China is going to have on the poor people of this world. So China is an extremely rich, but at the same time an extremely poor country still. And that creates that paradox in our mind, in our Western mind, of is China a developed country and is competing with us, or is China a backwards country that is underdeveloped and that needs to be developed still? And it's very hard for us to combine those two, but that's the reality and the paradox of China. Understanding this will help us to understand China. So I hope you liked it and hope to see you next week for another episode and another question on Pascal's China Lens.